Good morning, everyone. I'm Danielle from Temasek, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Before we dive into the panel, I'd like to first introduce Temasek for the benefit of those who may not be familiar with us. Next slide, please. Temasek is a Singapore-based global investor, and we turn 50 next year. We are owned by the Singapore government, but run privately. We have a diverse portfolio across sectors, including financial institutions and the real economy. Next slide, please. We are a purpose-driven, long-term investor, so every generation prospers. Generations in this case includes Singapore, current generations in Singapore, the communities that we are invested in, and future generations as well. Therefore, beyond financial outcomes, we also prioritize environmental and social outcomes. Next slide, please. Temasek has an ambitious target to halve our 2010 base level emissions for our portfolio companies by 2030 and achieve net zero by 2050. We instituted an internal carbon price of US $50 to price in the risk of climate change in our investment decisions. Our long-term staff incentives have also been aligned with our portfolio emission targets. Next slide, please. Our ethos is encapsulated in what our chairman, Mr. Lim Boon Heng, said. Succeeding as an investor must result in a better world and sustainable world for people and communities. Next slide, please. And now I come to my last slide in the intro on ecosperity. Ecosperity as a sustainability advocacy and engagement platform began a decade ago in a time where businesses had to be convinced of the why of sustainability. Ecosperity Week, our flagship conference, is the largest business-oriented sustainability conference in Southeast Asia. And I'm happy to say that now we have moved from the why to the how for sustainability in the private sector. Do join us from 15 to 17 April next year in Singapore. Next slide, please. And now let me introduce our moderator of today, Franziska Zimmermann, Director of Sustainability and Climate Change Strategy at Temasek. Franziska, over to you.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel sessions. I think many of you realized yesterday was Nature Day, and we heard a lot about the criticality of nature in the context of climate mitigation, but many of those conversations have actually focused on the terrestrial ecosystems. In the discussion today, we want to change color and shift our attention from green to blue. Ocean-based climate solutions have the potential to deliver up to a fifth of the annual greenhouse gas emission reductions as pledged under the Paris agreements. But ocean-based mitigation seldom features in the national climate targets. Especially Southeast Asia, with its long coastlines and the territorial sea space that is 3 times larger than its landmass, could offer opportunities for the development of ocean-based mitigation solutions with significant ecosystem co-benefits. Research seeking to identify and scale those ocean-based decarbonization activities alongside the development of robust monitoring, reporting and verification methods is currently ongoing. I'm very pleased to have some of the leading experts on this subject matter with us today to examine what can be learned from current research and the pilots. What will it take to catalyze ocean-based climate mitigation projects and spur investor confidence? And ultimately, how do we unlock the ocean as a key pathway to net zero? Now, let me welcome my panel on stage. First, Dr. Sally Beige, climate and ocean specialist, but also the COP28 lead for Monash University. Sally, please, if you join me on stage. We also have Benedict Chia, the Director General for Climate Change at the National Climate Change Secretariat in the Prime Minister's Office of Singapore. Hoon Ling Min, the Investment Director at Gen Zero, and Prof. Ko Lian Pin, the Associate Vice President, Chief Sustainability Scientist for the National University of Singapore. Welcome, everyone, and good morning to all again. Let me maybe dive first into the conversation, Sally. And I mentioned in my introduction, the focus of decarbonization activities have traditionally been on the territorial systems. But your research has shown that maritime ecosystems offer an untapped opportunity. Maybe if you can kick us off by sharing some more of your research and some of your findings.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the introduction and for having us here today. So the research that you mentioned at the start where ocean solutions can offer a percent. So last week, that was updated to 35%, the WRI in the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy. But that original research piece is what motivated us to look at research in different pockets of the world, and we looked at Indonesia initially through the Climate Change Centre where I was working at the time. And the intention was to see if for the world we're looking at, between a quarter and a third, how much of the solution to climate change could come from a country that is such a maritime leader, both in its policy, but also in the extent to which it has resources that could be used. And the research that we found was that 50% of the solution by 2050 could come from the ocean for reaching the 1.5 degree. That's an enormous amount. Now, that doesn't come from blue carbon alone. That also comes from offshore energy, from blue foods, from a host of other areas as well. But blue carbon was certainly a substantial part of that. And that piece of work was done to inform the Indonesian government because they're really interested in adding an ocean sector to their NDC. So there's the governance and the policy framing that you're also looking at to take this from research to moving into implementation.
Great. Thank you, Sally. And I know, Lian Pin, you and your colleagues at the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, you've also done a lot of research on blue carbon. Any additional perspectives from you on the opportunity in Southeast Asia, but perhaps also Singapore?
Yeah, thanks, Franziska. You're right. We have been partnering with, actually with Temasek for the last couple of years on a regional blue carbon project to build the knowledge base for blue carbon, not just in Singapore, but also across different countries in Southeast Asia. Now, one important thing to understand about blue carbon, and I think many of us here do, is that there are still lots of knowledge gaps. We know something about the carbon stocks of mangrove forests, for example, but we also know that there is huge variability across the region in terms of their stocks and sequestration rate. More importantly, if we imagine a mangrove forest or the carbon in a mangrove forest as a bank vault, we sort of know how much money we have in the vault. We also know how much savings we are putting into the vault over the years. But sometimes we forget that the vault is porous. There's also lots of things moving in and out, and that's the part that we really have a huge gap about. Great. And there's different elements that go into the vault, and I would like to dive a little bit deeper, right, into the different oceanic and coastal ecosystems, such as seagrass meadows, mangroves. Do we know actually enough about them? Do we know which one gives us more money into the vault? No, the simple answer is no. You're exactly right in that the ocean ecosystem is highly interconnected. So there is lots of exchanges, not just in terms of carbon, but also other gases and minerals and so on, between mangroves, seagrass, even coral reefs, mudflats, and of course also between the coastal ecosystems and the inland ecosystem. So this flow of material and energy and gases is something that we don't know very much about.
Will we know enough in time?
Fred will probably say we need to know within the next 6 months. So I think we need to know minimally for us to be able to activate the resources, the finances for us to protect these ecosystems.
Great. And Sally, you mentioned it's not just about nature-based solutions, right? You also mentioned there's other ways of actually leveraging on the ocean ecosystem and the ocean economy around it for mitigation action. Maybe you want to share a little bit more on those other areas and where you see the potential?
Sure, thanks. So there's obviously shipping is a large area, and that's handled by the IMO as a sort of separate space. But one of the key areas is offshore energy. And there was a study that is often quoted, done in 2018 by the IEA, that found that if we utilised all our offshore wind, we would have enough power, technically, to power the world 18 times over its current consumption rate. So developing those offshore technologies. The other, I think, element that comes in there is that in a country like Indonesia, there are real energy equity concerns. There are a lot of areas that don't have enough energy. On a global scale, energy access tends to be defined as having enough to power a mobile phone and a fridge for 4 hours a day. Now, most of us wouldn't consider that sufficient energy to run our households, to have clean cooking, to do all those other things. So these forms of offshore energy offer an opportunity in some of the remote areas to actually provide energy to people that don't have it.
That's great to hear. And given the significant potential of this blue decarbonization, Benedict, I was wondering, how do you see the policy process is actually taking up that particular potential, and how has this been flowing into all these conversations around the national determined contributions, but also the broader international policy objectives?
Well, thanks so much, Franziska. So I think if you take a step back and you look at the ocean ecosystem, it brings forth many benefits. There is clearly an abatement benefit, be it you seeing it as a carbon sink, seeing it as a source of green energy, seeing it maybe even as a technology removal solution platform whereby you store CO2 on a long-term basis in marine type environments. It is also clearly a source of economic growth, livelihoods, jobs, GDP growth itself, and many economies are actually very dependent on the ocean economy. And actually the other area which we have also been looking at is also the role of marine ecosystems, ocean ecosystems to adapt to the impact of climate change, being a lot more resilient to it. So there is very broad recognition that oceans ecosystems are important. The big question is, how do we get a handle on it? How do we quantify it? And I think that's something that the global economy has been struggling with, because unlike a terrestrial system whereby measurement is more straightforward, if you are looking at an ocean ecosystem where it's very difficult to segment one key aspect. I mean, Prof. Koh talked about the fact that it's a bank vault, but it's a very porous bank vault. You really need to look at the interactions. And I think that's one of the key factors that make measuring and assessing it more challenging. But there is a recognition, and I think the issue is how do we get different stakeholders, those with vested interests, to come together to advance that understanding so that we can better anchor in our national climate change plans, in some of the global discussions that are ongoing, because there is interest, but the issue is we need to get a good handle on it. And I think we really hope to use this as an opportunity to pull together different partners whom we can work with closely in terms of advancing our knowledge within this space itself. Thanks.
Yeah, no, and it's great. I mean, I did observe that the word ocean actually did feature prominently on the descriptors of the days, right? It's nature, land use, and ocean. So I think that's already a first signal that this recognition is there for sure. Now, maybe switching gears a little bit, another topic that this year is very important at COP is finance. We're always talking about how can we make things happen and how can we catalyze more funding into the critical areas for both mitigation and adaptation. Now, Lingmin, scaling up the blue decarbonization will require investment, as we know, right? Perhaps you can provide us a bit with a perspective on blue carbon project investments, which opportunities are attractive and why, and how would you think about perhaps the different types of opportunities?
Sure. Thanks, Franziska, for that question. Clearly, as we look across the various blue carbon sinks, there are a number of complexities. We've already heard about that from the other panelists. And so to help us, kind of go through some of those, we try to adopt a couple of lenses, right? One around the carbon sequestration potential. That is not just on a per hectare basis, but also the potential total restorable areas, which would then, give us an indication of how scalable or sizable the opportunity set might be. The other is also around the readiness for carbon markets, and why this is important, Franziska, around kind of having financing tools that are available to accelerate some of these investments. So we do see carbon financing as one of the important levers that can help to mobilize capital towards nature-based solutions at large, but particularly also for blue carbon projects. And therefore, we also look at the availability of carbon credits methodologies, which would give an indication on how we can go about quantifying and measuring the emissions reductions and removals. So if we apply these two lenses on the various carbon sinks, so on carbon sequestration potential, so across the board, I think on average, we're seeing mangroves to have the largest potential in terms of carbon sequestration on a per hectare basis, potentially even up to 3 times more compared to terrestrial carbon. And if we look at the readiness of carbon methodologies, in fact, there are already carbon credits methodologies on Verra, Plan Vivo, Gold Standard for mangroves projects. And it's about kind of close to 30 projects that are listed now, albeit at varying degrees of project development stages, and just under 5 million tons of credits issued to date. Of course, having said all of that, this is a fraction of the over voluntary carbon markets, especially compared to terrestrial carbon, where we see most of the carbon credits in nature-based solutions are still dominated by forestry projects. And that's not quite surprising because most of the mangroves projects today are on relatively small scale. We're talking about a few thousand hectares to tens of thousands of hectares. There are actually only a very small handful of projects that are above, say, 100,000 hectares. And therefore, it does give us a sense of the amount of potential that can still go into it. And in fact, I think 90% of the credits today are probably only issued from a small handful of 4 or 5 projects. Having said that, it is already tremendous progress, I think, for the mangroves project type relative to the other blue carbon sinks, where the carbon credits methodologies are even more nascent. I think things around seaweed sinking, for instance, hugely being researched at the moment. There are concept notes, but not quite yet published in terms of methodology. Although aside from carbon, we can also see other commercial use cases for things like seaweed, specifically macroalgae, where you can apply it to things like in agriculture and biofertilizers, for cosmetics, for consumer products. So I think across the board, at this point in time, we do think in terms of readiness, probably mangroves as a project type, but it is a dynamic space and we'll look across the different asset classes as well.
That's fascinating. And when you think about methodologies, what are some of the traits that you actually look for? What must be there in a methodology for you to have the confidence to invest?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about how investable a project type is, and by the way, this is not just specific to blue carbon projects, but generally across the board as we look at different nature-based solutions as well as community-based projects. So certainly things like additionality, permanence, co-benefits are of super importance to us. So just on additionality for mangroves, they traditionally and historically have relatively high loss rates. So something like 20% of mangroves have been lost globally over the past 40 years, right? So I think at the macro level, there is probably a case to be made for additionality. Of course, at every individual project level, we got to assess specifically whether there are really, for instance, strong domestic action there towards conserving mangroves, which could then impact the financial additionality of the project. Things around permanence as well. I think kind of mangroves projects generally deemed to have relatively strong permanence, but there are also risks associated to storms, flooding, pests, and sort of sea level rises. So in the project design, it's also quite important to ensure that we have sufficient land buffers so that to protect against sea level rises. And finally, on co-benefits, and I think that's also an aspect that is quite topical. Co-benefits, biodiversity. We all know kind of mangroves is a biodiversity hotspot. So it provides a critical habitat for various marine lives. And also in terms of community enhancement, enhancement around providing livelihoods, or even wrap some ecotourism around it. And from an ecological perspective, also offering kind of coastal protection. So I think these are the few key elements that we do look at in terms of the program quality. I will probably just add that when we look at how investable a project is, we will also think about the commercial viability aspect of it, right? So around the project costs as well as the kind of carbon potential associated with it.
Great. Maybe Lian Pin, if you could sort of also tag onto that, and your teams are sort of looking deeper into the methodologies, right, underpinning some of those approaches. Are there any additional observations, any insights from you on what needs to happen to accelerate this?
Yeah, sure. I think the research community can contribute to the effort of scaling up nature-based solutions and blue carbon projects in relation to those considerations by integrating, synthesizing, and even sometimes producing the layers of data or information that we need at beyond project site scale, because that would shortcut in some ways, in some sense, the investment in time and energy and resources needed to kickstart a project. Imagine if we have a map of the Southeast Asian region or even across the tropical region that contains many of these layers of information, not just the climate mitigation potential, but also the different risk layers, co-benefits layers, then investors and even potentially carbon project developers can immediately make use of those information to incorporate into their PDDs, their project design documents. So that's one thing. The other thing also to think about is perhaps more because a lot of the layers or data that you talked about are quite static, at least in the way that we are thinking about them. But in fact, many of those things are dynamic, right? They change over time. The risks change over time. Sometimes the co-benefits change over time too, and even the climate mitigation potential. So from the research community's perspective, it is also a research problem for us to see how we can incorporate that dynamic nature of these different considerations, again, into some kind of an information platform that could potentially even have far-reaching implications for how we value and maybe even determine or measure the amount of carbon credits that each project could be generating, maybe even on an annual basis, because the risks faced by a project could change over time, and so there could be different vintages of credits that takes into account the effort needed to protect the forest against threats in that particular year, for example, and so that could be the basis of another way of thinking about how we value and decide how much credits could be produced or sold for a project on an annual basis.
How do we monitor for those things, right? We also have very sophisticated approaches now in the terrestrial system. Are there similar approaches for the ocean-based projects as well? Do we have satellite observation that we can leverage, or how do we do some of these things?
Yeah, we do. As you rightly point out, we have been moving farther ahead in the inland systems, the green carbon systems. When it comes to blue carbon, even for mangrove forests, which are sort of coastal and most of it is exposed, at least for part of each day, it's still quite challenging to assess and monitor their carbon through remote sensing technology, because part of the forest and the biomass will be submerged, and when they are submerged, it's hard to detect them from space or even from other remote sensing platforms like airborne sensors or drones. More importantly, most of the carbon, so coming back to the bank vault analogy, right? So we know that roughly there are, across Southeast Asia, the average amount of carbon in the mangrove forest is roughly around 500 to 600 tons per hectare on average. about 30% of that, maybe 25 to 30% of that carbon is stored in the above ground biomass and maybe in the root system underground. But the vast majority of the carbon, 70% of the carbon, is actually underground in the soil. So it's soil carbon, and that is very, very hard to sense and detect and measure from spaceborne technology. So that, in many cases, still require people to go down to the ground to do soil cores and so on and so forth. But of course, technology is moving rapidly ahead, and there are some promising radar-based technologies that may eventually be able to do that. But we are finding it really challenging to be able to scale up at least the monitoring, the mapping and monitoring of blue carbon systems at the moment.
Yeah, I can imagine. Sally, you're nodding your head. Did you want to weigh in on this as well? Or?
Not so much on the monitoring, but on the fact that it's such a difficult challenge that we really pause moving forward in the policy space because of the difficulty of the challenge. And if we cast back 15 years to when we were looking at forestry, we created a whole lot of measures of equivalence so that some level of monitoring on a national basis could be done before we had the science to go forward. And I keep wondering what we can do in the blue carbon space in the way of more measures of equivalence so we can make a start before we have the information to really be able to do a full and complete assessment.
Yeah, great. And maybe, Benedict, do you have a perspective of this? I know you're involved in a lot of the conversation around the carbon markets as part of the negotiations, as part of the policy dialogues on how advanced are we? Are there any ideas that have been germinating?
Yeah, so we see carbon markets as an important tool and instrument to help unlock the abatement potential from blue carbon projects because it helps bring in financing and enable the project that would to have been implemented that would not have taken place in any other case. Our approach towards carbon crediting is what we term a principle and a criteria approach. So we don't say yes or no to specific categories of project, like yes to blue carbon, no to other forms of removal technologies. But if it meets our criteria, we are quite happy to accept it within our national system, allow our companies to use it to meet its carbon tax obligations. We also take a proactive approach in the sense that for us, it's not just about whether you meet the criteria or you don't meet the criteria. In the event that a project methodology or a project class is still very nascent, we are happy to work with different developers, different standards to ensure that whatever that is put in place eventually is able to meet our requirements itself. And I think on this blue carbon front there are some methodologies which Lin Ming talked about that are already in existence, but if you compare the methodologies against all the potential out there, I think it's really only a drop in the ocean. We still need more methodologies. We need the methodologies to be refined as we get a better handle on measurement. The other issue which also interests us a lot is how do we deal with risks of reversals. So yes, it is true. Blue carbon projects, if you look at mangroves, for example, can do 3, 4, 5 times the amount of carbon compared to terrestrial forests. But one of the challenges that we are grappling with is that, at least our initial sense, is that reversals are more likely. From the angle that blue carbon ecosystems need very specific conditions to thrive. And if those conditions, boundaries are not met, there would be a reversal event compared to a terrestrial forest, which tends to be a little bit more resilient on that front. So we also need to have a good handle on the how do we deal with risk, how do we deal with reversals, and that's, I think, one of the key criteria which we have in terms of trying to get a better understanding on that front. Thanks.
So that aspect about the permanence as well, right?
Yes, it's quite important. Yeah,
great. So carbon markets is one way of funding and channeling finance into those solutions. Ling Min, do you see, you mentioned also the seaweed, right? And the ability of the seaweed to perhaps contribute to other value chains, including food, feed ingredients and so forth. Do you see emerging other approaches of money flowing into that space?
Yeah, I think there are definitely kind of alternative bit technologies or approaches when it comes to various tools of valorization. So I think certainly from a commercial aspects, we have seaweed products, but as I mentioned, also there are technologies that are under research around kind of evaluating the efficacy of seaweed sinking and the permanence associated with that. I do see the carbon markets financing as still quite a critical lever. And I wanted to touch on a little bit around what Ben was talking about in terms of policy and from the perspective of a well-functioning market mechanism, that could be one aspect as well. Because we've already started seeing kind of blue carbon credits being traded in the market. Obviously, the volumes associated with those are still very low at this point in time, and the prices have traded fairly healthily in the high 20s to $30 per ton kind of range. And we think the premium associated with that could be a function of both, in part due to the scarcity value, just because there are very few blue carbon credits today, but also I think a reflection of the underpinning quality attributes we spoke about a little bit. Clearly more needs to be done around kind of project design, which is why I talked about land buffers associated with permanence, but the huge benefits associated with the communities and the ecological benefits, I think, are what some of the buyers are also pricing into the values of the carbon credits. So we do think that outside of the policy and technical progress that needs to be made, having the market mechanism will support the elevation or channeling of financing.
Yeah, understand. One of the things that you mentioned, Sally, as well, right? The blue economy is bigger. So there's the nature-based solutions, there's the carbon markets you can catalyze, but also the energy solutions that might happen offshore. Do you want to dive a little bit deeper into those abilities to contribute to mitigation?
I think just sort of sticking on the financial aspect for a moment to sort of address that more broadly, is SDG 14, which is life below water, is the least funded of all the SDGs, and yet it is the second highest when you rank it in meeting targets. And the question is, partly that's a question of, have we set the targets too low because we're not used to actually contemplating the ocean within that multilateral system in this same way, but also how do we get more funding into the ocean area? I mean, the fact that the ocean covers 71% of the Earth and it is the least funded of all the SDGs is, quite remarkable, really. In particular, when you think about the conversation that so many of the other SDGs are dependent on the ocean, not only climate change, but also zero hunger, gender equality, as we've spoken about with seaweed in particular. And so how do we get more broad funding beyond the carbon market areas into that SDG and into the ocean area? I think the other critical element, and I heard it this morning over at the Ocean Pavilion, said again, there's heaps of money for ocean, but there are no projects. Well, that's not true. There are heaps of projects for ocean, and what we're missing is that middle conduit that links all that funding to all those projects on the ground that are funder ready and are needing to be pushed. And that sits across the blue carbon area, but also the blue food area, and certainly, in some spaces, the offshore energy. I think there's a huge opportunity value for countries, in particular in Southeast Asia, that are the first adopters with offshore energy, to provide the skills, the technology, the understanding to other countries in the region. But they need support to go ahead and do that. They can't just sort of leap in all alone.
So I think both you and Lian Pin, you have been involved in many collaborations, and it seems to me capacity building, collaboration, and making sure that there's effective ways of working together is key. Any examples on where that has worked well, or any ideas of what needs to be in place to accelerate such collaboration and make sure that if there's money available, it actually flows to the projects that are critical to advance?
Yeah, sure. So as an academic institution, most of our collaborations involve either working with philanthropic partners or industry for their resourcing, their support financially, so that we can conduct our research, run our research projects. and or working with fellow researchers in the same community. For example, if it's blue carbon, then working with across the blue carbon community to collaborate on research projects. Usually through jointly collecting the data, sharing our data, or doing the analysis. So those collaborations have been very important for us because in what we are trying to do at the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. Research-wise, we are trying to move beyond the traditional pursuit of intellectual curiosity, intellectual novelty, to focus on research that could actually help inform policy and business decisions. And not all of that would be fundable or immediately fundable by the traditional funding agencies because there are lots of other research priorities that the national research foundations, funders need to also focus on or invest in. So having the ability to work with other sources of funding from other funders would help us achieve our goal effectively, of course, in combination with the traditional funders.
Yeah. And maybe if I can just chime in terms of kind of, and Lian touched on it a little bit from the perspectives of philanthropy. So I think that's when the concept of blended finance is actually hugely important for a sector that is emerging in this space. As you look across the value chain and the stages of the project, right? Clearly at the early stage where you're research, pre-feasibility study, conducting pilots, this is the when sort of development finance institutes, the foundations, the philanthropies will really come in to help, provide the capacity building on the ground. And when that kind of hurdles from the research perspective has been crossed, and I think that's when private sector and commercial capital can lean in to really scale these projects.
Have you seen examples of that?
We've definitely seen this model across different project types. As it relates to blue carbon, for instance, I believe Conservation International is also fairly active, having been part of the Blue Carbon Institute that's being set up in Singapore. So we are seeing kind of players already leaning in, especially in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia and Asia, where the potential is so huge. So hopefully this forms a little bit of a template that we can replicate across different projects globally.
It would be fantastic.
Sorry.
I was just going to say the other aspect that we really focus on is the in-country partnerships. So if you're working in a country, and I'll use Indonesia as an example at the moment because that's where I've been working most recently, we try and ensure that we have an MOU with an Indonesian university. I have Indonesian counterparts across there, and they need to be, from the beginning, a key part both for capacity building of their students, for relationship building, but also for implementation. So if you're doing your science and you're wanting it to be implemented in an area across there, you need on-the-ground partners that have the relationships and are trusted and can actually activate your science into policy.
Yeah. I was just going to add two more points. One is the other area for partnerships would be in the area of capacity building, which was brought out earlier. And I think the regional universities can play a huge role in that by working in partnership with the local communities, with each other, with the other universities around the region. Because especially in terms of blue carbon, the aspiration, the scaled up blue carbon projects, I think we are still short of the expertise in many of these areas to ensure that the standards are, or the methodologies are being practiced or implemented the right way to ensure the environmental integrity of the project. So we need to build up a strong blue talent pipeline for the region of Southeast Asia, for example. And one last point, also related to partnership, but this is a slightly coming at it from a different angle. Sometimes science can also inform how partnerships could work or what kind of partnerships might be needed. For example, we talked a lot about market-based mechanisms to help support blue carbon projects. And I know this is a business-focused forum, but some of the research that are coming out of our center shows us that, in fact, the vast majority of potential nature-based projects around the world, or high carbon and yet highly threatened forest ecosystems around the world, including mangrove forests, may not be financially viable for various reasons. Low density of carbon, maybe they're not as threatened, and so on and so forth. And in fact, we found that the proportion that might not be financially viable can be as high as 80%. So in that sense, this kind of research and science can also help inform the need for there to be partnerships between the funders of the protection of these high carbon and yet threatened forest ecosystems through blended finance, public-private philanthropic partnerships, and so on and so forth. So science can also help inform partnerships that way.
Yeah,
I think that's exactly right, because the reason why we talk about huge variability in project costs is precisely because it's so site-specific. The amount of work that's required to restore hydrological flows or sedimentation systems varies hugely. And I think, I don't know whether this piece of research is the right statistics. There's probably about 15 million hectares in terms of total mangroves areas, but the highly restorable ones are probably about 1 million hectares today. And clearly there's a range in between where it's from medium to low restorability. So if we get some scientific breakthroughs that can improve the restorability of that huge middle stack, then that will have a huge implication on the cost curve and drive investments into the space.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just to add, listening to the conversation, I think, so I agree with what Lim Min said, blended finance is important. I do also agree with what Prof actually highlighted in terms of what activities are bankable, what activities are actually not financially viable. But I thought we needed greater structure in terms of this. So we have always been talking about blended finance, but the challenge is that we need to look upon blended finance as more as an art itself. How do I blend? What's the process of blending? And there are many forms of financing on the table. You have got grants, some of it coming from government, some of it coming from philanthropic organizations. And depending on where they are from, they do have different requirements. Generally, the philanthropic grants are looking to do something more breakthrough, which is then able to scale much bigger itself. You have got technical assistance capacity building, and there are a lot of organizations around the world, multilateral organizations, putting all these together. Then if you look further ahead, there are things like concessionary financing, first loss, lower capital rates of return, and then you have got commercial financing, and then you have got carbon markets revenue. I thought the challenge that we face is, how do you structure all this together? What should grants be used for? What should, maybe at the other end of the stream, market revenue be used for itself? And I think that's where you need to start breaking down the various activities that needs to be implemented. And some activities are more amenable to certain types of funding. And my own sense, talking with various countries, speaking to various project developers, is that I don't think anybody has done this. And if we approach this issue of trying to look at blended finance as just really a spaghetti bowl, or rather macaroni bowl of things bundled up together, and if you look at all these activities as just one single whole, I don't think we're getting the most out of it. So my own view is that you probably need to structure it a bit more. You probably need to have a sense of what are the lower hanging fruits, what are the higher hanging fruits, which types of activities are more amenable to which type of blended finance, and then putting together a package that can then unlock some of the key pieces that we are talking about. Thanks.
Yeah, it's certainly an important point about the different types of capital looking for different types of outcomes as well. Now, let me turn maybe also to the audience to give the audience a chance to weigh in and ask questions if there's any from your side.
I think it comes back to the last part of this conversation about monetizing other streams than just blue carbon, because I think at the moment, with all the discussions about blue carbon, is there other avenues to take, so coastal protection, biodiversity, and so on. I was wondering, perhaps to your point, saying what are the other instruments that you think could work? Because I think philanthropy, yes, you can work on the first stage and so on, it won't last. So what are the other things? Do you see impact bonds, for instance? Is there something about monetizing impact on communities and so on that could work beyond just the carbon part of it?
Yeah, I think the various instruments, thanks for the question, Tom, it's good to see you. In terms of other instruments, they're available as a complementary set for sure, and I think that's under exploration. I think what's key in underpinning some of these metrics is the quantifiability and the measurability, whether we talk about impact, whether we talk about biodiversity, and whether we can translate those metrics into financially actionable kind of interpretations. So I think as the work is ongoing in terms of data collection and having the harmonization on interpreting what does it mean to generate the biodiversity, to generate that impact, that will go hand in hand with the climate and carbon impact assessed. And the jury's still out on whether these should be looked at in silos or in fact kind of come together and stacking together the various metrics to think about, because the project is very interlinked and all of these are outcomes from the same program. So whether or not you kind of dissect it and ascribe values individually, or you kind of bundle and staple them together within the same product. So I think that's one thing that the market is in the midst of evolution and maturing itself upon. I do want to make the point that we tend to think about carbon financing and alternatives. I do think that there is an interplay between this. It is through, in part, I won't say entirely, in part through the carbon financing mechanism that it releases additional capital that can be regenerated into other aspects of livelihoods enhancement, into biodiversity, into generating impact. So I do think there's an interlink, and it's not quite carbon standalone, because it is with the mechanism that it does release the capital which otherwise would not have been able to move some of the other social activities.
Yeah, so maybe if I can just add. So I do agree with you that actually understanding the non-carbon benefits is important in terms of biodiversity, in terms of how much it contributes to the livelihood. I thought the other thing that we also may want to think about is whether there's an interplay between some of these factors itself. I know for terrestrial projects itself, there have been well-documented cases that if you want to maximize carbon benefits, you would structure the project, or rather you would plant a certain variety of species very differently than if you wanted to maximize biodiversity. So there is a trade-off. And then the question is, where do you draw the line itself? Do you want a more sustainable ecosystem, or do you just want maximum carbon benefits? Maximum carbon benefits, you just plant the fastest growing tree, you get monocultures. But is that what you really want? So I think you raise a very pertinent question, and that actually makes it important to understand the non-carbon benefits, how they interact with each other, and then design a project that maximizes the overall value to the whole ecosystem, which may mean sub-optimizing carbon outcomes. Thanks.
Very interesting. Any other questions from the audience?
Thank you very much, dear panelists. I'm from Dai-ichi Life, which is the Japanese life insurance company. And since I'm from Japan, which is a country surrounded by the sea, I am very much interested in the potential of the ocean in terms of the energy generation or production. So I understand that the offshore wind is, of course, one big source of energy generation. But is there any other way of generating energy from the ocean? And that is my first question. And secondly, is there any potential of negative impact of having energy facilities in the ocean towards ocean ecosystem, especially fishery industries? Thank you.
I'll have a first go at that one. So yes, there are other ocean technologies. I think the offshore wind is probably the least impactive for other ecosystems and fisheries. And there are prototypes that are being designed at the moment that are artificial reefs that coexist with offshore wind. So there's all sorts of potential there. In terms of offshore wave energy and offshore tidal energy, they are both technologies that are being implemented more as small-scale commercial at this stage as trials, and that you definitely have to be very careful where you locate them in regard to other ecosystems, not just blue carbon ones, but protected areas, fisheries that are key areas, nursery areas, all those sorts of things. But they do have potential, in particular in some locations. There are certain ones, some of the tidal ones actually block and alter the tidal system, so they're sort of a last resort or something you would avoid entirely. But then there are other tidal systems that are less impactive, so if you've done sufficient environmental impact assessments, they are likely to be something that could be utilised in the future.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists want to weigh in or?
Not a huge expert on the topic, but I imagine that one of the important elements is also around life cycle analysis to see the emissions reductions from the implementation of the energy facility down to how the energy is being generated and to the outputs. So I think that having that life cycle analysis is probably important.
Great. Any other questions from the audience?
Well, if nobody wants to, I'll go ahead. And it comes back to what you talked about with seaweed. So we're seaweed fans. And so far, we're seaweed fans without the carbon. But I'm curious about whether you could talk a little more about what you see as the potential and potential risk in that area, and if you have any guidance or expectations to how that will develop.
Yeah, absolutely. I think quite a number of countries are becoming seaweed fans as well. So I think about it from two lenses. One around the commercial use case, and the other one is around the carbon sinking and storage potential. So I think from a carbon capture perspective, I think the technology is still being advanced at this point in time. Like I mentioned, there are concept notes relating to the purportedly high permanence, but really it's still a space that we need to discover over time, and also the implications on the entire marine ecosystem we talked about right before with energy. Same thing with seaweed. If you farm seaweed at scale and sink them, what is the implications of the wider marine ecosystems? On the former, though, in terms of commercial use cases, I think that is where it actually already gets quite interesting. So there are seaweed-based products, from biofertilizers to cosmetics to synthetic leather, even to feed additives for livestock, right, to reduce methane emissions. So I think some of these solutions in themselves will be anyways quite useful for the different value chain actors, from agribusinesses to CPG companies. And to the extent that, and we're very early on that, but to the extent that there are ways of valorizing the carbon potential associated with those, it will help to kind of reduce the commercial price points for some of these products, and maybe in themselves make the products more market competitive. So I do think that there are alternatives beyond kind of just leveraging carbon credits markets, but also pricing into the products in of themselves, if you can quantify the carbon reductions or emission savings from the underlying products.
Just a minor point to add to that. I think in addition to the carbon sequestration benefit and the fact that you can sell the seaweeds as a product, there could also be co-benefits from seaweeds. There could be bioremediation benefits too, having the seaweed help to filter the water, especially if you have lots of aquaculture in the vicinity. Yeah. That's of course still very poorly understood, but it is an area of interest and research.
I'm just going to add a human element to it, and we've been looking at some work with the health implications for those who are working seaweed farms, and whether there's a need to have an alternate source of income as well, say tourism, that you do at the same time, because there are some concerns emerging that if you're in countries and you've got, often it's women that we see as a potential for gender equity in seaweed farms, but there are some concerns as to the long-term health impacts of working solely in that industry, and I think we really need to look a little bit more at that as well moving forward.
Great. I realize we come to the time. It's going very fast when you have such an excellent panel. Thank you all for your questions. To wrap up the conversation, what I sort of would like to ask you is, having heard all of what we discussed today, if you had that magic wand and you say, I have one thing that I really would wish it would be in place to accelerate how we think about ocean and ocean ecosystem as a pathway to net zero, what would that one thing be? It's hard. Sally, any inputs?
You're looking at me. I'd like the science to be perfect. I think that would solve all the problems. If we knew everything, then we'd know what to do. But putting that aside, I think a really important pathway from a top-down perspective is better integration between the Biodiversity Convention that we work with, the UNFCCC and the Law of the Sea, where the BBNJ Convention was recently negotiated under. I think that without recognition of the synergies between those and looking at how we can govern for all of them, then we're going to end up with things that conflict with each other and aspects that just don't function.
Great. Benedict?
So I would like systems map that shows how everything is interacting with each other within the ocean and the marine ecosystem. This really, to me, it's really a light that would shine and would allow us to better understand how such interactions occur and where is our best point of intervention. Because I feel that's where we're struggling with right now. Thanks.
Ling-Lin?
So I guess the Limping's your deliverable for that. I think from my perspective, clearly the number of barriers on financial, technical, policy front. But if there was an aspect that I think will hugely help to catalyze the market, and Limping already talked about it a little bit, I think it's on the MRV portion, the digital monitoring, reporting, verification, and how that has an interplay with building the entire carbon ecosystem. Because we talked about how to make it more structured, how to have well-functioning market mechanisms. We have already things like standards, methodologies. We have also set up things like exchanges, climate impact acts in Singapore to facilitate auctions and transactions of credits. And we bolt on kind of powerful MRV tools, ratings, kind of building that, wrapping the entire ecosystem around blue carbon development of projects. And hopefully that instills a bit of confidence, both from a supplier's as well as buyer's perspective, into moving these projects to reality.
Just to clarify, is that 10-20 million to share among the four of us, or can each of us have the same quantum? But to be serious, I think so. This is my last, probably my last day at COP and last session at COP. One of the most important observations that many of us from Singapore, at least, and I probably can also speak for other people from the region of Southeast Asia, is that we've noticed how underrepresented our region is in many ways, in terms of actions, in terms of the science, the research, having a voice in fora like this. So if I had that 10-20 million, I would love to work with our regional partners to build an oceans research and education institute of some sort, hopefully in partnership with the philanthropic sector, with governments, with the private sector, so that we can both build a talent pipeline to help realize the potential of oceans-related climate actions and solutions, but also invest collectively in collecting the data and doing the research to scale up the implementation of these solutions and actions as well.
Awesome. That's what you call a perfect panel. We need the perfect science. We need a better understanding of how everything works together. We need better measurements, reporting and verification systems, and the whole trust system, plus one solution. We need a better collaboration in Southeast Asia, or we can forge that collaboration in Southeast Asia and really bring that to life in a region that's so critical for ocean-based mitigations. With this, please join me in thanking a fabulous panel today. It's been fascinating discussion. Last day of COP for many of us, so safe travels back home. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.